Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm your host, Dan Nash, and I'm joined by co-host Owain. Owain, how are you doing today?
Not bad today. We've got a rare in-person recording. We're sat next to each other on the sofa.
So we'll see how this goes. No awkward video backgrounds this time, and making sure I've hid all my dirty washing. Today we're going to talk about the physiological determinants of marathon performance. So it's sort of a bit of an extension of the theme we started last week, looking at what did we look at last week? Thresholds of marathon performance.
Yeah,
that was our last one. So we're gonna basically delve a bit deeper into actually the physiological determinants of the marathon. What does that mean, like acutely? So if you started a marathon today, what's going to limit your performance? But then long term, how do you know what's limiting you? What do you need? What is going to be the main limiter for you? I think I've butchered that already, but do you want to help me out here, Owain?
I think going a bit deeper than maybe just getting your VO2 max off your Garmin and letting that determine roughly what marathon you're going to run. Breaking down, I guess, the sort of central components of physiology. We're applying them here to marathon performance, but these are the components that get mentioned in pretty much every bit of research, aren't they? Like these sort of govern everything you do, from sort of every distance of endurance running. Yeah,
and like one of my very first podcasts I did, which was probably 2 or 3 years ago now, was just the physiology of endurance running performance, and it just broke down the classic model, which we'll go into a bit more detail later. And this is going to be effectively a marathon-specific version of that. So it's going to be a bit of overlap, very similar, but with the marathon season coming up, I think it'd be nice to re-go over some of that stuff, also making it more specific to the marathon. And there's some research trends, this idea of durability, which I'm not going to describe now, but it's basically we want to set this podcast up to talk about this exciting new area of research which is popping up about durability, or basically how does our physiology deteriorate over the course of a marathon. But we'll leave that for later.
I guess although we were saying, it's not the only determining factor, I guess we'll start with VO2 max. That's the best place to start, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And I think the VO2 max, so I think everyone's got a pretty good idea of what the VO2 max is, but we're not going to spend a whole 20-minute section talking about VO2 max, but we'll briefly introduce it. So the VO2 max is our maximal aerobic capacity. So it's effectively the quickest rate that we can take oxygen from the atmosphere, transport it through the blood, and get it to the muscles where it's used to break down fats and carbohydrates for energy for muscle contraction. And how we measure it in the lab is we stick a mask on you, we measure your oxygen consumption, ramp the intensity up slowly until effectively you can't run anymore. You've reached, and what you'll see is that oxygen consumption will go up linearly with speed until it gets to a point where it plateaus. So the speed will go up, but you physically can't get oxygen to your muscles any quicker. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think a really sort of layman-y way of putting it is it's the size of your engine. But then within that sort of framework, there's a lot of ways to get to a sort of end marathon result. You might not have the biggest VO2 max, but you might have, as we'll touch on in a minute, good thresholds, good economy. I know it sort of always comes up when you're talking about this, how the Breaking 2 project, they didn't necessarily have the biggest VO2 maxes, the athletes that were picked, but they had very good thresholds, very good economy. The shoes obviously helped the economy, but it's still, VO2 max is still important, but it's not the be all and end all, and it doesn't really correlate very well to marathon performance. When you take a population of elite runners, VO2 max is sort of not a good determinant of what their performance is going to be. It can vary quite a lot based on then what's sort of happening within that, I guess, engine.
Yeah, 100%. A few things there, but I just on that last point, if we got people who are running a massive range of performances, so let's say 4 hours down to 2 hours 15 for the marathon, then yeah, I think VO2 max would correlate really well with performance when you're looking at such a range of a population. But if we were looking at a bunch of runners who are running between 230 and 215, I think VO2 max would not correlate as strongly. I think it'd still be a correlation, but it wouldn't be a perfect prediction of marathon performance just looking at VO2 max in isolation. And that's because, as we're going to talk about, there's other determinants that contribute. So we can't just look at VO2 max, we can't just look at thresholds really, we can't just look at your economy. It's got to be a combination of all of those things that are going to determine your marathon performance. And there's also different ways that you can run a marathon. You could have a great VO2 max, but maybe not so good economy. So you've got to compensate by being a bit inefficient by having a really, really big engine, for example.
Yeah, they all interact, don't they? And I think that's probably going to be the take home point from this podcast is, don't focus on one. Understanding your own physiology and then how you can then maximize your performance is sort of, I guess, what the take home message will be. Like you said, you could have a really good VO2 max and almost like hide the fact that you have bad thresholds in economy. You got such a big engine that it's going to get you a good time. And in the opposite, you could have not still a very good VO2 max, especially compared to like a general population, but not the best VO2 max compared to the people around you, but you could have a really good thresholds, good economy, and sort of end up with the same result. So
yeah, and to break it down even more simply, like if we're talking, we could just look at race speeds. Like if you run a good 5K, if you run 15 minutes of 5K, you're going to run a good marathon. It might not be as good a marathon as you can run for 5K in terms of like national rankings or however you want to qualify it, but you're still going to run a much better marathon than someone who's run probably 18 minutes for 5K.
Yeah.
Like it's just intuitive that you need to be you need to have a good engine if you're going to run a good marathon. But I think just to go back to that paper you talked about with the Breaking 2 one, which it basically was really interesting. They just, in terms of really interesting to me, they just it was effectively a paper which is shared the result, the physiological testing of a bunch of runners they were considering for the Breaking 2 project, and they measured the physiological determinants of marathon performance, so VO2 max, thresholds, economy, and then they also did a trial where they ran them at 2-hour marathon pace and saw what their physiological response was to that. But the VO2 maxes were obviously good, but they were lower than I thought. They were typically between high 60s and up to, I think the highest was 80, which is good. You got it there.
Yeah, the mean for the group was 71.
71. So that's that's 71 is obviously in the context of the general population is really high. But I've tested plenty of runners with a VO2 max higher than that, and they're not running anywhere close to 2 hours for a marathon. My VO2 max, I'm going to talk about a bit more about my data later, but my VO2 max is consistently measured at between 76 and 80. And obviously I can run a good marathon, I can run 2:15, but there's no chance in hell I'm running 1:59, even if I took all the drugs in the world. That's it's, as we said, VO2 max is important, but it's not the be all and end all.
Yeah, 100%. I think coming back to your point about 15-minute 5K runners converting to the marathon, I think maybe you anecdotally, a lot of us know someone that's run 15 minutes of 5K but then hasn't converted to the marathon, and you think, well, this, they're running, 14, 30, 15 minutes of 5K, like why can't they convert it to the marathon? And that may be where they've got a great VO2 max and then, their thresholds and economy just never catch up, whether that's down to training or just,
the sort of athlete, the sort of athlete they are. Yeah. I think also in the shorter distances you can compensate by having a really good anaerobic capacity and that extra gear. In the 5K that can still make a bit of a difference. You if you're on the track and actually you can just hammer out a 60-second last lap, then that saved just 12 seconds right there. So that's worth a little bit too. But obviously the marathon, you can't rely on that to really contribute to performance very much. So let's just briefly dig into a little bit more about what VO2 max is and like the determinants of VO2 max. So it's prime for the vast majority of people. VO2 max is a central limitation, or it's centrally limited, which basically means that it's not to do with the muscles. It's not to do with them. If you can get more oxygen to the muscles, they will use it, and they'll just keep picking up and using more oxygen to break down fats and carbs. But the limiter is actually getting the oxygen to the muscles, and that is there's a couple of factors there. You've got one which is effectively the size of your heart. If you've got a stroke volume, or you can pump more blood in a single beat, then that's going to result in a greater cardiac output, and then you can basically get more. You can increase your transport rate of oxygen to the muscles. Do you want to talk about the effects of altitude that might have?
Yeah, I mean, I guess some people sort of think altitude, maybe makes your muscles more efficient with dealing with less sort of oxygen reaching them. But generally, the reason you would go to altitude is to increase the amount of blood volume in your body. Generally, 2 to 3 weeks later, you would see more either. It either gets measured as red cell volume or hemoglobin mass. Hemoglobin is the protein that sits on a red blood cell and carries oxygen. That's generally the reason why you're going to altitude. There's other, reasons. You've got the sort of training camp itself. If you're living a sort of fairly busy life and then you go to altitude, you're going to be able to focus solely on training. But yeah, generally it's to increase your blood volume. There's a couple of nice little sort of mechanistic studies where they had participants exercise for 4 to 5 weeks, and especially if you take people that don't really exercise, you'll see quite a big increase in blood volume over 4 to 5 weeks. That exercise itself just increases the amount of blood you have in your body, which then increases the amount of oxygen you can get to your working muscles. But they'll have those participants exercise for 4 to 5 weeks, and then the researchers will then remove the blood that they've accumulated, the excess blood. So if you've increased your blood volume by 400 mils, that blood gets removed, and then they retest the participants, and their VO2 max is back to where they were when they started out. So you've done 5 weeks of training, and you just take away that blood, and you're back to square one. That's one little nice mechanistic study that sort of shows that central, the effect of VO2 max. There's other work where they'll have people like exercising with one limb, so they'll be doing like either like a leg press or a leg extension with one limb, and they'll measure the oxygen cost of doing that, and then they'll have you exercise with 2 limbs, and you would think, oh, it's just going to double the oxygen cost, but it doesn't. It doesn't double it. It stays at it goes up a little bit, but it doesn't double. So there's this sort of factor where your body can only deliver so much oxygen to your working muscles. Your working muscles will take all the oxygen they can get. And there's elements of your physiology where your body actually limits the amount of blood it's going to send to working muscles. If you sent all of the blood you could to your legs when you're running a marathon, your blood pressure would drop so much you'd just sort of keel over and collapse.
Yeah, and you'd start getting you obviously need to keep directing oxygen flow to your brain, your skin to cool you down. Even like blood flow will be directed away from your GI system, but there's still going to be some blood flow go in there. Otherwise, you're going to start getting cell death and you have lots of nasty stuff going on. So basically you got your cardiac. The structure of your heart, so a bigger stroke volume, bigger cardiac output. If you go to altitude or just through training in general, you increase the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, so we get more hemoglobin, we combine more oxygen. So every unit of blood can hold more oxygen. So not only can we pump more around by having a bigger stroke volume, we can also each mil of blood can hold more oxygen as well. And then the last one is the extraction of oxygen. The transfer basically from the blood vessels, the capillaries, the small blood vessels that are associated with muscle fibers, and getting them out of the blood vessels and into the muscles. But actually, this doesn't seem to change all that much. It does change. It can get a bit better, but it seems to be that most of the limitation is more to do with the cardiovascular system in terms of the heart and the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. So that's VO2 max.
Yeah.
Anything else you missed there?
I mean, I'd only add, like, you like you said, you have changes to the structure of your heart, but you also have changes to your vasculature. So I guess the sort of pipework around your body that carries the blood as well. I think that's always missed. I quite like the vasculature stuff. It's so everyone focuses on the heart, but actually, your vasculature is as important. There's people that will say your vasculature actually controls your heart, rather than the heart controlling everything else. But that's maybe a whole separate podcast, isn't it? But yeah, you'll have changes to your arteries, your capillaries, your arterioles as well, through training. Not just you won't just increase the size of your heart as well. But no, I think that covers everything with VO2 max, at least for this podcast.
Yeah, nice, cool. So then that's basically our VO2 max. That's our first determinant of marathon performance. The second one then, which we'll come on to, is the thresholds, or LT2, the lactate turn point, maximal lactate steady state, whatever you want to call it. That speed you can hold for about an hour. That's the sort of that's the threshold we're talking about here, not to get confused with the LT1. But yeah, as we said in the previous podcast about marathon pacing, you're going to have to sit just below that threshold for majority of a marathon. So on the day, your LT2 is going to be the most important thing, probably. Like, we don't really care about your VO2 max then. It's about actually how good is your LT2 on the day, sitting just below that for the majority of a marathon. If you've paced it well, hopefully you can push over in the end, and you might finish up towards VO2 max. So maybe VO2 max is a bit important in terms of how much you can push, how much work you can do above your LT2. On the day, you just want your threshold to be as good as possible. But the reason why it's not just about the threshold, in terms of taking the long-term approach, is there's only so high you can push your threshold relative to VO2 max. And for most, I mean, there's putting a clear number on it is probably difficult, but out of all the people I've seen in the lab, I've never seen anyone with an LT2 that's above 91%, maybe 92% of their VO2 max, which is obvious, really. Like, again, if we go back to just looking about paces, like, you can't hold 5k pace for 10k and you can't hold 10k pace for a half marathon. Like, that's just not how it works. It's going to have to be some drop off in speed for it to be sustainable. And so then it gets onto the question of when we're talking about, or when I've got someone in the lab and I'm looking at what's their primary limiter, even if they're focusing on a marathon, if their threshold is at 91%, 90% of their VO2 max, even like 89, 88, you're starting to think, well, your threshold is probably not going to improve much more. So then the question is, you're not limited by your thresholds. On the day of a marathon, you're going to be limited by your thresholds, but you can't improve your threshold further without probably first increasing your VO2 max. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that VO2 max does set the limit. Although we mentioned, that a high VO2 max can hide bad thresholds, a low VO2 max also sort of can't be overcome. You can't increase your thresholds to 100% of your VO2 max. I mean, just skimming the sub 2 paper again, looked like they sort of found their best athletes were having their threshold occur about 95% of their VO2 max. That's top of the top elite runners. I don't think many people are going to be having theirs occur at that point. And those are people that have probably been training for the marathon specifically for a long amount of time as well. They're not, if we're thinking more like club runners, they're not dabbling from 5k to marathon.
Yeah. And I guess with caveat, they've been born and raised at altitude. I think all of them were East Africans effectively. Yeah. Maybe there was one Caucasian, I can't remember. I'm not sure. They don't really include their names, but I think I think some people have gone through and looked at all the media and stuff, but I'm pretty sure it's vast majority East African. Born and raised altitude. And then you got the question of, are they clean? Have they been doping? Like, all these things. Like, there's talk of you'll probably know this more than me, but like I think there was a time in the Tour de France where everyone had a hematocrit of 50 because that was the legal cutoff. But no one has got no one naturally has a hematocrit that's 50. Like it's just it's one of those things where actually you can probably push your physiology to places where you shouldn't physically be able to get to with assistance. No, I'm not implying that any of these people are, but it's just something you got to talk about when you're talking about performance athletes. I think you just don't know what the history is, and it's also it's a little bit determined by how you're calculating the threshold, what method you use. You can again thresholds. It's hard to. We've talked about this before. It's hard to just specifically define. Okay, your threshold is at 18.8 kilometers an hour. Well, you can probably be pretty confident it's above 18.5 and probably below 19.5. But if it's exactly, 18.8, it can be a bit hard to tell.
Yeah, I mean, this paper, I'm pretty certain it was funded by Nike, at least partly. They've got sort of all of the scientific resources in the world and they're still given that 1 kilometer an hour range. So, where if you ever hear someone say it's like their threshold is exactly this speed, it's not. It's gonna vary on the day as well, isn't it?
And I think the more data you have on someone, the easier it is to establish exactly where their threshold is, and if you can link it up to some performance data as well, you can be pretty confident. And by more data, I mean people come into the lab like multiple times. Like for example, me, I'm pretty confident I can pinpoint my thresholds. I'd certainly give it. I'd say like a couple of points of a kilometer an hour range. I'm talking about certainly not a K range. But yeah, I think we're getting a bit distracted. So the threshold is basically going to determine what percentage of your VO2 max you can sustain for the course of a marathon. So if we talk about a threshold like we have already in terms of a percentage of VO2 max, you might fall from anywhere between, or let's say 95% at the very top end, but some people it might be down at 80% or even a little bit lower. Certainly if it was someone who was completely untrained, it might be really, really low, like, I don't know, 60, 65, 66, so that sort of percentage range. And I guess the other caveat is that the fitter you are, the faster you're going to run a marathon, and then that means you're running for less time, so you're going to be able to hold a higher percentage of your VO2 max as well. So if you're running for 2 hours, 15 minutes, then you're going to be able to hold a higher percentage of your VO2 max than someone who's running for 3.5 hours, because the duration is just different.
Yeah, and there's other factors that will come in as well in terms of how long you're spending out on the course. Things like fueling, heat build up as well over time, musculoskeletal sort of deterioration as well. But
100%.
yeah, I think I know in preparing for this we sort of anecdotally mentioned that you really, I guess in the sort of UK club scene, it is really common to hear people say that they set their PBs at different distances than the marathon whilst they're doing marathon training. And I know we sort of talked about this and thought maybe it's because everyone does a lot of what they call VO2 max work. They do their 400 meter reps to 1k reps at VO, I'm in quotation marks, at VO2 max. Normally they've determined that from like an online calculator as well. And then they go to marathon training and they're actually working on their thresholds and improving their thresholds, and then they're starting to set PBs at other distances as well. It's quite common you'll do like a half marathon or a 10-mile before a marathon in the UK. They'll set a PB at the half marathon and they'll set a PB at 10k, and it maybe sort of speaks, this is anecdotally, we haven't got these people in the lab, but it maybe sort of speaks to the fact that for a lot of people, their VO2 max in terms of the balance of these physiological determinants, their VO2 max is maxed out, without massively increasing their training volume or going to altitude or whatever else. They've got
the majority of the benefits they're going to get in their
whereas
VO2 max.
Their thresholds have a lot of potential to be trained, and they start to hit that potential when they're doing marathon training. And actually maybe if you maybe take some of the sort of training that you're doing during a marathon, these sort of longer reps, and longer reps, more running a bit faster, actually benefits sort of all distances as well. But yeah, I know that's just something we sort of anecdotally mentioned, isn't it? That yeah, you quite often see and hear that people say they set loads of PBs.
Yeah, during a marathon block. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like I'm not quite in a marathon block yet. I'm getting ready for Valencia, but I ran a 5k PB of 14:05 a couple of weeks ago at Podium 5k in Cardiff, and I hadn't done any running at that speed at all. I'd done so that averages out at like 67 high per 400, 67 seconds point something for 400. I think I'd done some sessions where I'd done the most intense session I'd done was 3400s off 30 seconds recovery, and I started them at 70s and I got 171s maybe, and I got down to 69s for the last 10 or so. That's as fast as I'd ran, and that probably indicates that my VO2 max is not my main limiter. It's my thresholds. Even down to the 5k, your thresholds are really, really important. People think it's above you. We're getting really sidetracked now, but we'll do this another podcast, I think. But just to say that even in the 5k, even though it's above your threshold, the thresholds are really important. I'm not going to explain why, because that could take half an hour. But yeah, I guess if we spoke about the determinants of VO2 max, we should probably talk a little bit about the determinants of thresholds. Now, I think with the thresholds, it's a bit less clear in terms of what actually determines them. It seems to be that more controlled, longer, bigger sessions help them. So things that are like double threshold type training, or just more controlled running at around, about just below your threshold, doing longer reps in that sort of intensity seems to help them. But what actually is improving, I think also training volumes are just easy running. That's probably going to impact your thresholds more than it's going to impact your VO2 max.
I was going to say, if your name's Inigo San Milan, you'll say that lots of zone 2 running is going to improve your thresholds. It's going to improve your mitochondrial function.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there's definitely, so your mitochondria are going to be important because they are effectively going to limit, the more mitochondria you have, the greater a rate of fat oxidation you're going to be able to have, but also carbohydrate oxidation through aerobic means, so not glycolysis, basically through oxidative phosphorylation. So if you've got more mitochondria, you can probably break down carbohydrates at a greater rate without relying on glycolysis and lactate production. So that is going to be important. But also I've seen capillarization implicated in thresholds as well, and there's definitely a couple of papers in cycling that have found really strong associations between the capillarization of the muscle fibers. So how many capillaries, how many of these small blood vessels are in contact with each muscle fiber, and their critical power, or effectively their LT2 intensity. So that's probably to do with the transfer of oxygen from the blood into the muscles, and if that's a bit faster, then you can probably make sure that those mitochondria are getting all the oxygen they need to perform oxidative phosphorylation and burn carbohydrates and fats in a sustainable way.
There's going to be muscle fiber sort of composition is going to affect that as well, isn't it? So the more type 1 fibers you have, you're going to have greater capillarization, more mitochondrial density.
Yeah, 100%. That's the problem is with physiology is it's not all that clear cut. And some of the determinants of VO2 max are also going to probably determine your thresholds. It's like, for example, if you've got a greater oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, that's going to improve your VO2 max, but it's probably going to have a good chance of improving your thresholds. You can have a greater rate of oxygen delivery to the muscles, greater transfer, a higher concentration gradient of oxygen in the blood to the oxygen in levels in the muscle fiber. So it's all related. And I think, the literature definitely is not that clear, I would say, on what determines the thresholds. But for the sort of purpose of training, it seems to be that longer, more controlled sessions in easy running. And I guess that's my main takeaway really. And like that's what you can do. We really I find it really interesting what determines the thresholds, but what we really want to know is what trainings you want to improve it, I guess. Or I imagine that's what you guys want to know. So cool. I think we've covered threshold there.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's another podcast you can go listen to if you want to.
Yeah.
About thresholds as well. There's if you go back into the previous episodes.
Oh yeah, that was again one of my very first ones. So yeah, you could dig back into that if you're interested. Right, do you want to introduce our next one?
Yeah. So next up is running economy. So running economy in this regard, we're just talking about physiology. We're not talking about like how efficient someone looks at running. That's a whole separate, well, it's a topic we're not even going to discuss because biomechanics, isn't it? We're not particularly into biomechanics.
I know nothing about biomechanics.
But so when we're talking about running economy in terms of physiology, it's just the oxygen cost of running at a set speed. Generally in sort of elite populations, it's measured at 16 kilometers an hour. Because when you're measuring running economy, you need to measure it at a speed that's not or is solely using oxygen as the energy.
Yeah, so I think it depends on who you ask, but you either need to be below that first LT1, that first threshold, or below that LT2, that second threshold. I think you can get away with stuff. When it's you can do stuff at marathon pace, but you just need to be aware that you're going to see more drift in your physiology over time. So actually, running economy is going to trend worse quicker when you're above your LT1 versus when you're below it. So as long as you take that into account, and when you're designing your testing protocol, then you can do that. But like you said, often it's quoted as your oxygen consumption at 16 kilometers an hour, because for an elite runner, whether you're male or female, your LT1 is going to be above 16 kilometers an hour, but probably not much above it.
But yeah, essentially with running economy, it's either quoted as the oxygen cost per minute per kilo of body weight or per kilometer. I think we use per kilometer a lot more, don't we?
So basically you can just look at the VO2 number. So like your VO2 max will be expressed in mil of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. You can just look at the submaximal VO2. So for example, at 16k an hour, it might be 51 mil per kilogram per minute. But you can also express it in the mil per kilogram of body weight per minute. No, not per minute, sorry. The mil of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per kilometer. So effectively, how much oxygen do you need per kilogram of body weight to run a kilometer in? Which is quite nice, because then you can compare against different speeds. So with it, when you're framing it in that way, it's going to be a number between probably 150 and 250. With the lower the better, because if you're using less oxygen, then you're obviously more efficient. Just like in a car, like if you're looking at miles per gallon or liters per minute of fuel used, like if the lower the number, I guess not miles per gallon. I've got myself confused here, isn't it? Miles per gallon is it's a stupid way of looking at fuel efficiency.
I guess you can get more miles per gallon of fuel in terms of running economy. You can use less oxygen to run a kilometer.
Yeah, and you basically the lower number, the lower the better. Because that means you need less oxygen or less energy effectively to run at a given pace. You can break it down even more than that. You can actually look at the calories per kilometer, which is probably an even better way of looking at it, because you're then taking into account whether your energy is coming from fats and carbohydrates. But when I've actually looked at it, it normally comes out very similar to just looking at the oxygen consumption, and it's a more intuitive way of doing it, and it relies less upon formulas it relies less upon formulas and more on just direct measures, which I prefer, to be honest.
So yeah, generally for marathon performance, a better economy is going to be better. Going back again to VO2 max, like a high VO2 max could hide a bad economy. But if you're more efficient, like we said, you use less oxygen. So then you don't necessarily have to have as high a VO2 max. If you're really efficient, this is where super shoes really sort of make a difference, isn't it? A couple of weeks ago we tested someone, and the first part of the testing they were just wearing sort of daily Hoka trainers, and then they put on the super shoes, and it was a massive difference, wasn't it, in their economy?
Yeah, they were 8% more efficient.
Yeah.
And that's probably like a super responder, or what I would call a super responder. They were 8%. You talk about the Nike 4%, as in that's what they quoted 4% because they reckon the shoes made you on average 4% faster. Well, yeah, this person got 8% faster going from normal trainers to super shoes. And that's crazy. Her economy went from being pretty awful to actually, all right, not bad at all. Which could take years and years of training, but just by putting on a different pair of shoes, you get those responses immediately, which is great. But yeah, I think economy, because if you go back to talk about the 5K, where VO2 max is going to be very, very important, you could go, oh, well, VO2 max is going to correlate with 5K performance, but it's not going to, because actually you could run 15 minutes for 5K with a great VO2 max, but really poor economy, or like you said, Owain, with actually a much lower VO2 max, but fantastic economy. So you can't tell unless you actually get someone in the lab and measure them. And sometimes you can guess and go, oh yeah, I reckon that person's really efficient. And sometimes they're not. And there's a great paper, which I quote all the time to coaches. That it basically got them to, I think, I can't remember the details off the top of my head, but they effectively got 10 international level coaches and got them to rank a bunch of athletes just by watching them move, saying, okay, which one's the most economical, do you reckon? Which one do you think moves the best? And which one do you think moves the worst? Which one do you think is the least economical? And then they got those athletes, tested them in the lab, and there was absolutely no correlation at all. You cannot tell from looking at someone if you're economical or not. I've tested people who look like they move absolutely awfully, and their economy's pretty good. And I've seen people who move fantastic. I mean, must have great running economy. You just look like a beautiful runner, and their economy can be awful. And I think that's not to knock biomechanics, but there's out of our university, a recent meta-analysis came out that basically looked at all of the it collated a lot of papers where they'd looked at economy and they'd looked at the biomechanics, and the basic conclusion was biomechanics doesn't explain that much of the running economy. So not much of someone's running economy can be explained by the way they move, their biomechanics. So it is actually some biomechanical factors such as your ground contact time, your cadence, the elasticity of your tendon, that is going to influence your running economy. But actually, it's not just about that. It's also about your physiological responses and what's going on within the muscle themselves. And we're also complicated. It's really hard to measure. We all got different lever lengths and heights and weights, and it's very difficult to just look at someone and say, yeah, you're economical, you're not economical. I go further, I'd say it's impossible.
Yeah, you see it quite a lot, don't you? People saying, oh, they don't look very good, but you don't have any idea. Maybe if that's a takeaway from this podcast, you can't just look at someone and say, oh, they're economical or they're not. And we have people in mind when we're saying this. There are people that don't look particularly efficient when they're running, and they are incredibly economical and very good runners. It's impossible to tell, and we test people in the lab, and then that's sort of one of the first numbers we can see, and sometimes we're surprised, like you say, you see someone that looks really good, and you're like, oh, they're not actually that economical. It's quite interesting. But I guess in terms of the physiology that determines economy, it's going to be similar to the thresholds, isn't it? It's about again oxygen delivery to the muscle. So if you've not got much capillarization, not got much sort of mitochondrial density and function.
Maybe. I don't know if it's more within the muscle itself. So actually, within the muscle fibers themselves. So actually, it seems to be, although it seems to be that the slow twitch muscle fibers, the type 1 muscle fibers, are more economical, more efficient than fast twitch muscle fibers. So that suggests it's something within the muscle themselves, that processes are influencing actually how good they are at converting oxygen into speed effectively. But that I'd say that what determines running economy is even less well known than thresholds and definitely VO2 max. It's just very difficult to measure. There's a lot of factors. How you scale the oxygen consumption. Do you do it to body weight? Do you do it to... I've seen people do it to like body weight to a power of 0.8 or 0.7 because they think that's more appropriate. It's very difficult to sort of break down exactly what even economy is. So,
I mean, that's then gonna, you know, like we were saying, what determines thresholds? What can you do in terms of training? Again, brings in sort of the same issue where probably more running is going to make you more economical.
Yeah, I mean,
bringing in more running is gonna I don't want to say produce, but you're going to have more the slow twitch muscle fibers, the more sort of training volume you do. That's probably going to be the best way to get better running economy.
I think certainly certainly just doing more years of running, you're going to get more economical. Almost a classic Paula Radcliffe paper, which tracked her physiology over effectively her whole career. I think she first got tested when she was 16, and this paper included data all the way up to after she'd run 2:15 for a marathon, and her economy, her VO2 max didn't change very much, but her economy just trended better year on year on year. So I think there's definitely something to be said with just doing more years of training. And I've got about 8 years of physiology data on me, and mine has done the same, in that I had pretty awful economy to start with, not awful, but not great, and now it's gotten to a place where it's pretty good, not world class, but it's better than most people's. Certainly at the lower speeds, I struggle a bit at the higher speeds. So I think years of training definitely helps.
Like we said, you know, it's less clear if you don't understand the mechanism behind what determines it. Then it's hard to sort of point training towards it as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a good amount of literature now to show that strength training and plyometric training can improve your running economy. So instead of thinking about biomechanics and how you move, I sort of encourage people to go, right, what do we know influences running economy? So having good elastic tendons, Achilles tendons that store more energy and recycle more energy, we know that contributes to economy. So let's do training that's going to improve the qualities of our tendon. And that basically means doing strength training and doing plyometric training. And by strength training, I'm talking about things that are lower leg core. Actually, people go on about having a good core. The literature is pretty skeptical on whether having with core muscle training influences economy. Maybe if you're particularly poor, it might. But actually, we're talking about strengthening the calf, the quad, the lower leg, the joints, basically the joints around the ankle, knee, and hip. That's where you can lose energy, and just making sure that you're not giving way, collapsing there. Especially stuff around the calf, which targets the Achilles, so calf raises, isometrics, isometric like calf presses, and then plyometrics as well. So even just there's a paper out there that came out recently, only in pretty untrained people, but they just got them to do 5 minutes of pogo hops, so just hopping on. I say hopping, so it's like two-legged hops, if that makes sense. 5 minutes of that, 5 days a week, I think it was. It might have been every day, but five to 7 days a week, and we did that for about 4 weeks, and their economy got quite a bit better, about 4%, so the same as super shoes. I don't think that response will be the same if you were already running a lot, but it just shows you that you can train your muscles to be more reactive, basically, and spend less time on the ground. And the problem is, if we're spending a long time in the ground, basically your Achilles can't store energy then, because by the time your foot takes off, that energy is dissipated. It can't just store, like an elastic band can't just store energy in it can't store energy indefinitely. If you stretch it and let go straight away, it's going to fire further than if you stretch it for a long period of time and then let go, basically. I'm not sure if that analogy, that yeah, I'm not sure that analogy crosses over perfectly, but that's how the Achilles works. And that's the limit of my biomechanics, so I'll stop talking about biomechanics now.
I mean, I was probably going to be a point for the end of the podcast, but we sort of mentioned it now. The Paula Radcliffe paper. If you want to do some more reading after this podcast, it's like, I think the first place to go, isn't it? Like I've done a lot of research from it. I've got it up on my screen now. They've got her VO2 max from 1992 to 2003, and it, as Dan says, stays the same, pretty much.
I mean, very good VO2 max, like 70, which is fantastic for such a woman.
Yeah. But then her running economy, you can just see a downward trend, and it's massive. It was over 200 in 1992, and then by 2003 it's 175.
Yeah,
like that's there's going to be shoe improvements within those.
But probably
years,
not
but
that much, especially in that period of time. There wasn't much development there.
A little bit.
They might have got a bit lighter, but yeah.
It's a really good paper. It sort of talks about the physiology as a whole, and then specifically talks about Paula Radcliffe, and I think it's a really good place to go.
Yeah.
In terms of determinants of running economy, everything we've said is what they sort of talk about as well. They mention altitude, but you don't really know what's happening, and I'd say this paper came out in 2003, 4, or 2006, but since then the sort of thinking about altitude has changed, and I think sort of really focuses on the blood volume increase. So if anything, sort of remove altitude from the running economy, or possibly affecting running economy. But yeah, I mean, we'll chuck it in the show notes, I guess. But yeah, the Paula Radcliffe sort of paper is such a good resource.
And I guess the other one is the classic Michael Joyner one, which I referred to in my previous podcast, but we can put that in as well, which basically talks about how I'm going to wrap it up. Well, not wrap it up, but basically surmise what we've talked about already. But so if we've got our VO2 max, like that sets our our ceiling for aerobic capacity. We've then got our thresholds that determine like what percentage of our VO2 max we can sustain. So, right. So I guess one thing we didn't talk about with the thresholds. Did we talk about what percentage of the threshold? We did talk about what percentage of the threshold we did. Yeah. So basically, we've got a VO2 max. Our threshold is going to determine what percentage of that VO2 max we can sustain for during a marathon. So, okay, we've got a VO2 max of 80. We can just our thresholds occurring at let's say, I'm going to start this again. I've completely messed this up. Third time lucky. So, you got your VO2 max. Your threshold is going to determine what percentage of that VO2 max you can sustain during a marathon, and then your economy is going to effectively going to translate what does that percentage look like in running speed. So, you've got a VO2 max of 70. Your threshold is, or you can hold, let's say, 55% of your VO2 max for a marathon. So 55 mil per kilogram per minute for a marathon, and then your economy is going to basically determine what that translates to in terms of actual race speed. And you can, as we've alluded to all through this podcast, you can pull on any of those three factors, which could influence marathon performance. And certainly should inform the direction you go in training, actually what's limiting you. And I'm going to give you an example now, just going through my own numbers. I like to test before every marathon, like in the week or two prior, which is just gives me a bit of confidence going into the marathon, what I'm going to be able to achieve. But before Valencia in 2023, Valencia Marathon, I ran 2:15:19. So my VO2 max, I had it measured I didn't measure my VO2 max in the week of, but I did measure it. It had been measured pretty recently. I actually did it the week after, I think. I can't remember what it was then, but VO2 max for me is more recently, well, in the last year, I've had it measured twice at 80. So let's call it 80. My LT2 occurred 87% of my VO2 max, so pretty high, but maybe hopefully a little bit more room to squeeze some more pace out of that. And my economy at that speed was not amazing. It was about 200, and let me just find it now. I've got my massive spreadsheet up. It was about 209 mil per kilogram per minute, and that effectively translates, my LT2 speed translated to 19.8 kilometers an hour 4:53 a mile. So then we're going, okay, right, I'm going to be finishing a marathon it's going to be under 2:20. So if we say I'm going to, I'm going to hold 96% of that, then I think that works out as, I should have done this beforehand, shouldn't I? Basically, I ran 2:15 and it worked out as 93% of my LT2. So that's the thought process I'm going through. Actually, what's my VO2 max? Is my LT2 good enough to run the time I want to run, and what's my economy looking like at that speed as well? And then for my next marathon block, I'm going, right, okay, actually I've still got room to push my threshold up a bit, not massive, but probably a little bit. My economy's still not great at those speeds. My economy's got better, as I said, and it's actually better at the slower speeds. At slower speeds, I can be down at 190 mil per kilogram per kilometer, but as it gets faster, I get progressively worse. So the key takeaways for me is I can hopefully just my economy can keep getting better, and I can improve my threshold a little bit. And I guess the last thing we haven't talked about is durability, which, do you want to introduce durability?
Yeah, so durability or fatigue resistance, sort of the idea that two runners, I think the analogy that gets used is a quite nice graph in some research papers, isn't it? Like two runners set off with the same sort of VO2 max thresholds, economy, but if one has better durability, they're going to be able to sort of resist the fatigue of a marathon, and their performance is going to not reduce as much over the course of a marathon as a runner with less good durability. It's a real sort of growing trend of research in running and cycling. I'd say probably cycling a bit more. If you think about a cycling race, like we've got the world champs in cycling coming up in a few weeks. There's going to be people like putting down massive watts to attack, and then they've got 3 hours left of a race. And so how can you sort of resist the fatigue? And in terms of professional cycling, I know they do a lot of work around that and have done for years, and it's now coming into running in terms of, what's your sort of, I guess, what's even a way of measuring durability? It's hard to measure, isn't it, at the moment?
And I think, if you're very basically going to look at it, you could just look at your heart rate drift over the course of a marathon and go, actually, if you're someone who's got a massive drift, although you think you've set out at a speed that's quite appropriate for you, then that's probably a sign you're not very durable. And we've done stuff in the lab where instead of looking at heart rate, we've gone more direct and looked at the drift and oxygen consumption. And if your oxygen consumption is very stable over whilst running at marathon pace, then that's a sign you're really, really durable. But if actually after 45 minutes of running, an hour of running, your economy is getting a lot worse, then you're not a very durable runner. And I think we're going to do a whole other podcast on durability. Probably quite soon, I think, because we're on a bit of a marathon trend with marathon season coming up. But yeah, I think things are going to influence your durability. Obviously going to be your training's going to influence your durability, and that's probably going to. I think the durability is something that's going to just keep improving compared to maybe a VO2 max, which probably plateaus reasonably early in your running career. But your fueling is going to certainly influence your durability. If you're getting on lots of carbohydrates, then that's going to help maintain your running economy. We are more economical burning carbohydrates versus fats. So if you can get more carbs into the system and actually use them, then you're going to be more economical just in general. And certainly the back end of a marathon where you start to be fuel limited. So yeah, I think we'll do a whole other podcast on durability, what that means and how maybe we can train it. But I guess that's another thing to add. That's a fourth dimension to add to the model. So yeah, like I said, VO2 max, your top end, your thresholds determine what percentage of that you can sustain. Your economy translates that into an actual running velocity, and then your durability is actually over the course of a marathon. How much does your physiology deteriorate? How much does your running economy get worse? How much does your heart rate drift? Because we definitely know that if we got someone, if I got someone fresh on the start line of a marathon and tested them, and then they did a marathon, and we tested their physiology at the end, their physiology would not be the same. I can guarantee their economy would be a lot worse. Their thresholds are going to be worse. They're not going to be able to get to their VO2 max intensity, and even if they can, it's going to result in a much slower speed. But yeah,
Yeah, I think a whole other podcast for durability, because it's like we said, it's a big growing area in research, and I think it's probably at some point there's going to be something big on Runner's World or wherever talking about durability. So we'll talk about the science of it soon, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's an exciting area, and another area where I think the literature needs to catch up to, but there's it's an area that people are starting to think about more, and probably is another scope for interventions to have an effect on the training and your performance.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, I think we've covered it. I think like we said at the start, take home is it's not just about VO2 max. Like I said, your Garmin will tell you your VO2 max, but there's more to marathon performance, and as we said, more to other distances.
I wonder if actually the conclusion is it's not just about thresholds, because
true.
Yeah, we talked about that in the last one about how important the threshold is, and it is really, really important on race day. But what is limiting you long term might not be a threshold. It might be your VO2 max. If you've done loads of threshold work and you're still not getting any better, then maybe it's your VO2 max that's your issue. Or maybe it's just that you actually, maybe your threshold might be a really high percentage of VO2 max, but doesn't translate into a good speed because your economy is really bad.
Yeah.
And you might need to work on something else.
The take home is come get tested with Dan.
Yeah. The take home is always come to the Sport Physiology Hub and get tested. But
I mean, we joke about that, and we don't want this whole podcast to just be a plug for that, but like it is such a useful tool, isn't it? Like getting tested, and you can only get so much from watches and
intuition
VDOT
and
like there's a lot more going on under the hood that you don't know about, and like we did say, like there is multiple ways to get to a marathon performance, and understanding how you specifically have got there then points your training in the right direction, and we see what I guess sport governing bodies is the right word, and even training groups are doing in terms of profiling their athletes and saying, okay, like you've done these performances, but what's going on to get you to that performance, and then how do we point your training towards that? It's becoming sort of the real, I guess, method behind training, and we talk about like Norwegian method and what like Norway does and what happens in the UK. Athletes are being profiled, and the best runners that you're seeing at the Olympics, they know what their VO2 max and their threshold and their economy is, and then they're pointing their training towards that. It's not just they're not just sort of guessing. They know what they're doing.
I guess like you said, Owain, I don't want this podcast was never intended to become an hub of a Sport Physiology Hub, but if we're talking about physiology, it's always going to come up, isn't it? But yeah, I think if you're looking at what the countries that are doing very well do, like Norway, for example, they're very systematic in their approach. They will test periodically throughout the year. So they will go, right, we're testing athletes, right? They've had their break, they'll do a bit of training, right? We'll test them in October, see what we need to work on, do that training, test them again. Did it work or not? Did we change the things we wanted to change? If it was great, if it did, great. We'll keep doing that. If that's still the lever we need to pull, if that's still the thing we need to work on. If not, we need to try something else. But it's definitely just, I think it's just being, like I said, a systematic scientific approach to working, which you don't need to be, I don't think you need to be, have access to loads of scientific equipment to work systematically and in a scientific way, which is basically just being, like I said, systematic, changing one thing at a time in your training, see how you respond in terms of actually how does that influence your performance, and then changing something else, and not just trying to change a million variables at once and then see if that worked or not, because then you don't know what worked and what didn't. And I think just taking a more systematic scientific approach seems to be, I think, where the Europeans and the Americans are catching up with the East Africans. Because the East Africans aren't doing lab testing, the vast majority. Like some of them get shipped off to the US for a Breaking 2 project, but they can rely, I think, on other things which we can debate or not of whether they're genetic advantage, but they certainly have a culture for running. There's certainly a massive incentive, and it's going to get you out of poverty. And if you've got probably 1,000 1,000 Ethiopians, 1,000 Kenyans, 1,000 Ugandans all running 120 plus miles a week, 200 kilometers a week, with loads of intensity, someone's going to be really good. Like, I think that's the advantage they have, but maybe the Europeans and the Japanese, I guess, as well. They've got a good culture of running, and they have a very similar approach. I think the rest of the world has a very similar approach. One is ones who are being successful anyway on the world stage have certainly embraced a more scientific approach over the last few years.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's it for now.
Yeah, we've hit the hour mark, an hour and 23 seconds. I thought this might be a reasonably short one, but I was obviously wrong there. Anything you want to say?
I think we're going to stick in the show notes and I guess on Twitter a link to send in some sort of questions. I guess at some point we'll do a Q&A episode, I reckon. Definitely. But if, not just necessarily for a Q&A episode, but if there's, something a burning question you've got, we'll post a link to just a Google form, just to chuck your questions our way, and maybe we'll do a Q&A episode at some point.
Yeah, we'll definitely do one at some point. Yeah. I think durability maybe the next one, or maybe we'll go Q&A. But yeah, I think those two are definitely on the cards. So I guess thank you for listening. We'll be back soon. Nothing to plug this week. No, right. We're not plugging anything this week apart from we've dropped the Sport Physiology Hub in again. But yeah, we'll put that'll probably be a recurring theme, I'm afraid. Just ignore that if you live in the US or wherever you live in the world, unless you're really really keen. Then yeah, probably there's probably somewhere more local to you where you can get tested and yeah. But anyway, I'll stop rambling. Thanks for listening. Catch you soon.